Welcome to AI-tocracy, where we are trying to vision the future, the positive future, the hopeful future of technology. I am your host, Dylan Thomas Doyle, and we are workshopping our catchphrase. It used to be the intersection of where AI meets power. Sometimes it's where technology meets power. Now we're trying to do more of a positive spin on the whole thing. And so we're going to keep workshopping it. If you who are listening to this, the hundreds and hundreds of you, apparently, we're very lucky, very excited to have so many of you watching our YouTube and listening to our episodes on all your various podcatcher places like Spotify and Apple and all the rest of them. Thank you all so much. But if you have thoughts, even critical thoughts about how we're framing this podcast or what brand language you would like us to use that resonates with your heart, please do let us know in whatever comments you would like to leave. But for now, we are talking today with Dr. Tom Williams about his new book, Degrees of Freedom on Robotics and Social Justice. I love Tom. I think Tom's great. I think this book is great, and you'll be able to get your hands on it in a few short months when MIT Press, who's the publisher, makes it free for everyone to download. But that is going to come in a few months. For today, you get a little sneak peek of this book. Again, we're here with Dr. Tom Williams on Degrees of Freedom on Robotics and Social Justice. We hope you enjoy. We are on the line with Dr. Tom Williams. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so this is a very special episode for me to do because Tom has been a personal supporter of mine over the years and was episode 3, I think, or in that first batch of episodes that we released for Radical AI almost 5 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, which is amazing to think how time has flown. And so this is also a good way for me to catch up with what Tom's been up to in the world. But yeah, I think this will be fun. And today, Tom, we are, of course, talking about your upcoming book, Degrees of Freedom on Robotics and Social Justice. But before we get into the book itself, I'm going to ask you the question I ask everyone, which is, Is there something particularly inspirational going on in your life or in the world right now that you'd like to lift up?
Yeah, I don't know what types of answers you've been getting to this question, but the one I'll give is the thing that has been inspiring me is for the past year, I've been spending most of my free time doing improvisational theater.
Oh, cool.
And just the ways that community serves to lift each other up, serves to make sure that it's creating a safe space for everyone, the ways that members of the community engage in mutual aid when folks are laid off from jobs or et cetera, and just the breadth of people who are working in different areas like education, healthcare, et cetera, that it's been just a joy to meet. So I think the thing that's been inspiring me is participating in that type of community that's just entirely dedicated to the art of listening and understanding each other in conversation.
Oh, that's amazing. So that does seem to tie into some of the topics in your book. So I'm just going to start by... Yeah. Hey, Tom, you have this book coming up.
I do.
Tell us about it.
Sure. Yeah, so AI-tocracy, right? You said it's at the intersection of power and AI, right? And that's basically what this book is about. It's the intersection of power and AI as it pertains to robotics. It's all about the ways that robots and robot designers in particular reinforce certain inequitable power structures in today's society, the ways that is grounded in the history of robotics and the specific sort of literary and engineering factors that led to the emergence of robotics, and the ways that then today helps to explain the specific types of power that roboticists are wielding, the default effects when they wield the power in the ways that they tend to, and the solutions we might have to try to subvert those dynamics.
With so robotics
Yeah,
is a big topic.
it is a big topic.
And I feel like it's transforming very quickly in how we think about it, what is covered under this umbrella. So before we go into the history of it, when you're talking about robotics, is there a particular either definition you're operationalizing or a way that you're considering it?
So that's challenging, and we talk about the definition of robotics right at the beginning of like every class I teach, right? And it's hard because robotics started out not as an engineering concept, but as a science fiction concept, and robotics has evolved over time as this sort of mutual interplay between science fiction and engineering. And engineers get into robotics because they see movies that excite them, right? Yeah. And so the definition of a robot, to some extent, is when you think of a robot from popular culture, what do you think of? In more practical terms, we typically use a definition like a physical thing in the world that takes actions to act on the world, which sometimes works and sometimes also accurately describes like thermostats and elevators and dishwashers. So it's hard, but they tend to be things that are in the world as man-made artifacts that are acting on the world, whose appearance and the way that we think about them is the result of the history of the robot imaginary.
Can you say more about the robot imaginary?
Yeah, so the robot imaginary is this is the sort of shared cultural understanding of what a robot is, right? And so this relates to the word robot that came from Karl Čapek in his play Rossum's Universal Robots. It comes from the work of Isaac Asimov, which built on Čapek, which gave us the word robotics. And it comes from the earlier literature that both of those built on, like Le Futur, which was a French science fiction story which popularized the word android, and which was sort of a reactionist work that was raising concerns about the women's suffrage movement in France. And earlier work like The Steam-Man of the Prairies, which was maybe the first appearance of a robot in literature, which used the mechanical man as a sort of a metaphor for what for black slave labor and what American white Southern men were going to do with the end of slave labor in the United States. And so the imaginary is sort of that history that has evolved around what we think of when we think about a robot, what it looks like, where it's used, etc., which then shapes how we continue to depict robots in science fiction, how we design robots in engineering labs, and so forth.
When we're talking about the history of robots, it sounds like it starts somewhere. This idea, both, it sounds like there's like maybe a technological part where it's like we're building robots, and then a more story narrative driven part. I know some folks draw the history of robotics back to, say, the idea of automatons in ancient Greece, I believe, and maybe in more like biblical sense, like the golem. Do you agree with that? Like, is that for the robot imaginary? Does that like?
I think it's complicated. I think so. The sort of order I would say is you've got in ancient Greece, you've got the ideas of automata, and even at that time they were being envisioned as a replacement for slave labor, a different type of slave labor than antebellum United States, but that's how Aristotle wrote about them, but sort of it was still sort of a far future concept. It wasn't viewed as like an engineering project. You then have early automata, which were engineering projects but weren't designed for tasks, right? They were used as art pieces, or they were used in like occult rituals, or for like stage magic or things like that. Then you have the Steam-Man of the Prairies, which I view sort of as the origin of the sort of modern robot imaginary, because of the ways that it interconnected those two, right? It was a character in science fiction, but that was directly inspired by a patent a couple months earlier, where people were trying to literally, make a real engineering product. And then that inspired through the early history of science fiction. About 100 years later, you get Asimov writing his short stories about robotics.
And
And you have
that's like mid 20th century about.
yes, mid 20th century. Yep. And you've got Engelberger, who was inspired by Asimov's stories and worked to make the first factory robots. So you have sort of these, again, purely literary to engineering curiosities to this moment in time in the 1860s where suddenly these are brought together in a generative way that then leads to, a century later, robots emerging in factories and appearing in science fiction in a very specific way.
When you're saying like appearing in a specific way, more in the Terminator way, or more in a different way?
As human-like entities that are designed as and envisioned as a replacement for slave labor in the United States, that are being put into work environments where they are performing the types of tasks that low-income people and people of color are performing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and there's a lot going on right now in June of 2025 about AI replacement and robot replacement of labor or of jobs. And so that is a backdrop of this conversation a little bit, because there are justice issues baked in to all of it. It looks like you wanted to say
it's why I was at ICRA, the big robotics conference. Probably the largest, main academic robotics conference a couple weeks ago. And I was leading the AI ethics forum there, where I brought together people who were working on issues of surveillance and labor and so forth related to robotics. Mm-hmm. And at ICRA, they've got a giant expo hall, right? And all these robotics companies are showing off their robots. And 90% of it was humanoid robot, robot dog, humanoid robot, robot dog, right? And with the humanoid robots largely, right, being depicted or envisioned in some type of manufacturing context, and the robot dogs primarily, being used in more like security or defense contexts, right? And it was sort of disappointing because, the technology is very, quote, cool, right, in terms of the engineering efforts needed to get it to work. But it's just seeing such a large percentage of the engineering community devoting their time and effort towards sort of continuing this history of robots automating or degrading labor in industrial contexts, or these new uses of robots that we're increasingly seeing of robots being tools in policing. Both of which I think are, potentially very harmful to society, and thus just depressing to see, like, the greatest minds in robotics that are coming out of grad school primarily being funneled towards those domains.
Yeah, well, so this is an aside, but I am curious about your take. What's the deal with robot dogs? Like, why are all the things that have, say, like Boston Dynamics, right?
Yeah.
And this was, maybe decades ago, at least 1 decade ago, where it was the big thing is that they came out with this robot dog that was doing robot dog things. Why? Why is that the animal we chose?
Well, I think that it is because the quadruped form from an engineering perspective makes a lot of sense, right? It doesn't have the balance issues that you're going to have on a two-legged, a bipedal robot, right? And then if you're looking at that, actually some of the early ones that Boston Dynamics were making were these larger, like, pack mule, donkey type things, right? But like the smaller form factors that you're going to be able to sell to a research lab or to most like non-military domains is a smaller quadruped, and dogs just sort of make sense in that domain. And so I think the form factor it's not that they were. I don't think it's that they were just thinking, let's make a dog and then made that. It's they made the form factor and then they decided to sort of like back describe it as a dog and program it to do dog like things to help to solidify that metaphor. Which I think is another example of like the interplay in between like engineering and science fiction and what we think we're designing on the technical side, how we describe that in a way that seems more magical or aligned with science fiction or future looking, and then the way that feeds back in and shapes the actual engineering activities that are done.
Yeah. Well, I want to work our way backwards to where we are right now,
Yeah.
or maybe I guess forwards. Since
Yep.
I think one thing that your book does is traces that history. But we're kind of talking around this idea of social justice and the language of social justice. So, as a reminder, the book's title is Degrees of Freedom on Robotics and Social Justice.
Yep.
Talk to me about that second part about robotics and social justice.
Yeah, so the main framework that I use in the book is the Matrix of Domination, which is this framework from Black feminist thought, which in part analyzes the ways that power is wielded in the service of oppression, right? And so the Matrix of Domination breaks power down into 4 categories. There's interpersonal power, which is, the power we wield through everyday interaction. There is cultural power, which is like norms, biases, stereotypes that might be reinforced through interpersonal interactions. There's disciplinary power, which is about the sort of the rules, the informal or formal rules of the game that manage oppression, the logics of race, issues of surveillance, etc. And then there's structural power, which is about institutions, codified laws, etc. And one of the points I make in the book is that in robotics, for those of us who talk about power in a social sense as opposed to an electrical sense, historically people have pretty much only talked about interpersonal power, right? There's so much work on like, can robots persuade you to do X, right? For good or for ill. And my lab has done a ton of that type of work, right? But we don't talk about those other domains, right? The ways that robots can the ways that roboticists through robot design can reinforce stereotypes through the ways they design robots, the ways that roboticists can reinforce specific logics of race and of surveillance through the ways that their robots perceive people or the ways that those robots reason morally, and the ways that roboticists can reinforce institutions that are used to structure oppression through their decisions of, for example, like, do you collaborate or work with the police?
Mm-hmm. When we're talking about, say, oppression, and I know in this book you talk a lot about robotics and race.
Yes.
When you're thinking about oppression in this historical context, maybe in this racial context, what are you talking about? What are you thinking?
Yeah, so I'm primarily in the book. I primarily talk about race and gender, which isn't to say that they're like dimensions like class or sexuality aren't also important. And in fact, those are topics that I also talk about, but it receive a little bit less focus, simply because of the ways that race and gender concerns have been sort of baked into robotics from the beginning due to its connection with slavery, with race in particular. But then in terms of the ways that those factors are especially salient in the visual design of robots, right? Robots are different from AI, especially in the ways that they are often embodied characters that are depicting physical people that are in the real, and are embedded in the real world into human contexts of work, often in ways where they are replicating the or they're put into the same roles as people in ways that reinforce these stereotypes in different ways. 2 examples I'll give of that. One is there was this robot, the Enki robot. It was a South Korean English language classroom robot, which was this sort of squat form, but then it had a tablet on it which had a white woman's face. The kids are told it's autonomous. It's not. It's teleoperated primarily by Filipina women whose facial expressions are mapped onto that white woman's face as they're teleoperating the robot, right? And so it's sort of a perfect storm of a lot of the ways that these issues interplay, right? The robot is being designed with this white woman's face in order to portray what was viewed in South Korea as this sort of correct English language instructor due to the history of American imperialism in South Korea and in the Philippines, which then sort of reinforces that particular stereotype, while also like hiding the labor and hiding the identity and the race of those Filipino women who are controlling the robot. Which
those women are in the Philippines.
In the Philippines, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So like kind of you're outsourcing labor
yes,
as well,
right? Which is not just reinforcing stereotypes, but reinforcing particular like labor patterns, right? And so I think that's a great example of the ways that a lot of these systems, whether like race, gender, and class, right, are all interacting and intersecting in the design and the deployment of the robot in terms of what's motivating it, and then also what the downstream impacts are.
Was there a second example? I know I cut you off.
Oh, did I say it was sure? A second example would be there was and one of the examples I used in the introduction of the book, and that I think helped to push me on this path, was in 2016 when I was a PhD student. I spent a month in Bremen, Germany, and while I was there, a DFKI, which is the German AI Research Institute, had their like once a year open house day in Bremen, and where you could go and see all the cool robots they were working on, right? And they had this robot, Isla, the artificial intelligence lightweight android, which was designed for space exploration contexts. But it had this. The form was it was in a woman's form. It had sort of female morphology with waist to hip ratio, breasts, etc., and then also feminine cues in terms of like the haircut, the look of the eyes that sort of mimicked makeup styles, or the way that maybe you might see women's faces portrayed in animation. Mm-hmm. And on the one hand, this is maybe a little counter-stereotypic, right? It's maybe pushing back on the stereotype of space as a male-dominated industry. But on the other hand, I had questions about like, well, why make this robot so? It wasn't like hyper-sexualized, but it was sexualized, right? And so I asked the designer or the technician standing next to the robot why they chose to give the robot this form. Why they chose to give the robot a chest. And his answer was, it was so we could fit more computer chips in. Which, yeah, obviously is like nonsense, right? That doesn't explain why you would constrain other parts of the robot's morphology, right? And when I included this anecdote in the book, and one of the comments I got back from one of the early reviewers was, well, this seems a little bit unfair, maybe. Like, that was just the technician. You should talk to one of the designers. And I was like, yeah, that's a good point. So I sent an email to one of the lead designers, and they said in their email back, I'm going to try to quote from memory. I can tell you why we chose to use feminine and female morphological features in the design of the robot. In short, it was a cheap hack to attract attention. It was something along those lines. And then talked about the ways that they intentionally use femininity to try to gain attention to the project due to problems they were having on the engineering side. And then he sent me their vision board, which showed all of the different clusters of different feminine robots that they had identified as part of their design process from science fiction, which were extremely hypersexualized, right? And so all these different clusters of highly hypersexualized robots. There was a annotated line of shame, which the things on the other side of it were like literal sex robots. So they had drawn this line and said, well, we aren't going to make it a literal sex robot, but we're going to draw very explicitly on all of this history of science fiction and the ways that specifically feminine robots have been presented in sexualized ways in science fiction, and use that to inform how they designed their robot to achieve sort of like their, not sales because they weren't selling it, but sort of like their sales goals, right? And I think that's another example of the ways that, like, even today, often we talk about this, and I think people have a tendency to say, well, maybe a robot is designed as, more feminine, like, implicitly, right? And like it's because the designers, that's just intuitively how they were thinking about it, and they aren't really aware of the stereotypes that they're leaning into. But that's not always the case, right? Sometimes the robots like today are very explicitly and intentionally drawing on this history of stereotypes because sex sells.
Yeah. Do we see that as something that's increasing right now? Or it sounds like this has always been baked into how people are, like, the capitalist machine, right? How people are selling this thing.
I don't know that it's increasing. I think so. It's interesting that, like, with the history of the like the robot imaginary, the way that the robot form has shifted over time, right? Where again, if you start with the Steam Man of the Prairies, right? You've got a robot depicted in the image of a black man. If you look at the work it inspired, you then have like Le Futur, which shifted it to be in the image of a white woman in order to tell stories about the rise of women's suffrage in France rather than stories about the end of slavery in the United States. Yeah. You then have like Carl Chapek's Rossum's Universal Robots, which kept this white humanoid form, in part because it was building on that history, and in part because it was a play with human actors in the Czech Republic, right? Yeah. And then when you get to Asimov, Asimov's stories keep the mostly masculine humanoid robot form, but the robot is coded more. It continues to be coded outwardly more as white, and the robots are doing things like quoting HMS Pinafore and other things that are like culturally white coded, while being put into domains that continue to be, while the robot is outwardly like coded as white and masculine, and that's sort of portrayed as the domain of robotics. Inwardly, and the domains that the robots are put into tend to be the domains associated with either like feminized domestic labor or the labor of like working people of color. And today, if you look at humanoid robots, obviously none of this applies to like robots that are if you've got like a robot designed to look like a bird, right? This doesn't apply. Or like Boston Dynamics dog, right? Like these visual characteristics don't really apply. But if you look at humanoid robots today, and people have done analyses, like corpus analyses of these, they tend to either be portrayed as white and masculine when they are in domains that are traditionally masculine, or as white and feminine when they're put into domains that are viewed as traditionally feminine.
We've talked a bit about the sexism and sexualization of robots. To get back to race, and specifically in this book, you talk about the history of slavery and how that interplays with robotics. And I imagine that's not necessarily one of the more controversial areas of the book, but I do imagine that you're going to have some fun conversations when the book comes out around this topic. Could you talk about that? Yeah,
I know. I mean, it continues to be in ways that are very frustrating. An example I'll give from a couple days ago is, so me and a historian have a paper that we had under review, which is talking about like the historical issues that robotics students should be aware of, right? And it was drawing on the book. It was drawing on his history dissertation. And when we were talking about we talked about Asimov, right? So I'll give two examples. So we talked about Asimov and we talked about Engelberger. And with Asimov, we talked about like the ways that it drew on this past history, and then the ways that his like Asimov's laws of robotics, some scholars have analyzed as like a computational slave code, which is, I think, justified from a historical perspective as well, because Asimov's characters in his stories refer to the laws of robotics as instilling slave complexes, and because Asimov credits the laws themselves not to himself but to his editor Campbell, who was a notorious apologist for slavery. There used to be a Campbell like science fiction award that has now been renamed because he was such like a noted like apologist for, and proponent, and was saying we should go back to the slave system, right? So that was on Asimov. On Engelberger, the engineer whose work was inspired by Asimov, Engelberger has been quoted a number of times as being very clear about his motivations and the connection between robots and slavery in his eyes. He has a quote, for example, where he said, "Well, we are not allowed to have slaves or kick around black people anymore, so the robot serves that purpose."
Whoa.
Extremely explicit, right? Very explicit, both in connecting slavery, race, and robotics, and in aligning his own perspective with the former slave owners, right? This is very similar to Ruha Benjamin has this example in Race After Technology of this advertisement or this popular science story from the 1950s, which says, in 1865, Abe Lincoln freed the slaves, but in 1965, slavery will be here to stay. We'll all have personal slaves again, but we won't fight a civil war over them. Framing robotics, which I think also has the same pattern, right? We will all have slaves again, right? Again, positioning themselves with the slave owners, right? And so Engelberger, and this is not alone, right? There's a number of quotes like this from Engelberger where he makes this connection and talks about the connection with slavery. One of the reviewers we had that we got this week of the paper was like, this is unfair. I interacted with Engelberger in the 1980s, and he never said anything racist to me, right? And so, wild, right? So like these connections are very like historically documented, but there are still, even today, lots of roboticists and especially like the older wave of roboticists are very hesitant to acknowledge these connections. In part maybe due to hero worship, and because like a lot of people in robotics and a lot of nerds maybe grew up reading Asimov stories and or get excited about them, and of course then it's uncomfortable to show some of these historical connections. So
it's what you mentioned as well towards the beginning of the interview, where you were like, these science fiction stories that a lot of engineers grow like that are the motivation for them doing the work in the first place, to have to question them within dicey or completely like unjust, right, political context is I imagine really difficult for their identity.
Although I will say that it's something that's been great to see is like differences generationally in engaging with these, where generally, not always, but generally, the graduate students when I give talks on this, like the graduate students are more or less all on board, right? And I think some of that is just a heightened social consciousness among like the new generation of young people and roboticists.
Kids these days.
Right? Yeah. And to some extent, it might also be that there's been less time in the formation of the engineering identity to make it difficult to reconsider.
When I want to stay on slavery for one more second, just because I think it's interesting to think through. When you're talking about slavery, is there also a part of this, because the U.S. history obviously is rife with like chattel slavery and with the actual movement of bodies, not just the metaphor, right, of slavery, like you're saying, like black bodies being abused, and so is that connected, like the actual physical like chattel slavery? Do you bring that line through?
Yes. So specifically talking about that context. I mean, this isn't to say that it's only a U.S. thing, right? Sure. And sometimes people. I remember when giving talks on this in the Netherlands, and the Dutch scientists saying, "Oh, this is just an American thing. Like, race isn't a problem in the Netherlands. Slavery is American history." Like, which is obviously very ahistorical, right? But I think there's something very specific about the history in the United States of chattel slavery and the not not to say that it was completely abolished, but the like at least on the face abolition of slavery that gave rise to these concerns that spawned early robotics in science fiction and in engineering, right? So it is specific to that particular form. Today, it is it's complicated, right? The domains in which we are seeing often it's a little bit less literal, right? If we're seeing robots deployed into factories, for example, it is maybe more connected to just exploitation of workers as opposed to like specifically slavery there. However, it's often still in racialized ways. So when Tesla's Optimus robot came out, where they had the PR event a couple of months ago, in the aftermath, there was on Twitter or X. There were a number of influencers who were, especially like South African influencers, who were posting about it, specifically envisioning it as a replacement for black female domestic labor in their contexts. So it's still wrapped up in labor in a way that is often explicitly racialized. The other thing I'll say there, just in terms of like, I will acknowledge that like, to some extent, it is a global problem. To some extent, things are different in different countries. So in Japan, for example, after Rossum's Universal Robots, wildly different reactions in the United States versus in Japan. So in the United States, Rossum's Universal Robots came out. That was, depicting robots as workers and in semi-racialized senses, like there's an abolitionist character in RUR, etc. And in the United States, like engineers doubled down, right? You had like the Westinghouse Corporation had a robot that they released at one of their events that was designed in the image of a black sharecropper, and they invited people to like try to shoot at it and to shoot an apple off of its head, but inviting people to inflict violence on this racialized robot form. Whereas in Japan, the engineers in Japan saw RUR and explicitly said, we don't want that to be the future of robotics here. We want to design robots that are friends rather than tools. And so they created like the first like robot that they designed in the aftermath there was not designed. It was intentionally designed not to perform tasks. It was designed for social interaction, right? And that shaped the evolution of humanoid robots in Japan. And that's not to say that none of these patterns appear in Japan today, but there are some fundamentally different historical through lines in different locations. And so this specific history originating in sort of the history of slavery in the United States is most relevant in the United States. So I'll give that caveat.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. I had a personal question for you, so take it where you want to go. I'm wondering for you, and I'm not making any assumptions about your identity, but I think I've heard you identify as a white man before. Yes. And I'm wondering what it was like for you to write this history, especially invoking slavery and black slavery specifically.
Yeah, I think it's important and this is something that like when I was reading Patricia Hill Collins's work on Black feminist thought, she explicitly underscores in the book the importance of white men participating in and helping to doing this type of work, because it's important for everybody to be doing, so that it doesn't, and to counteract the assumption that otherwise sometimes forms that engaging in like DEI topics is the domain of people who identify, who have marginalized identities, which is then used to sort of undercut the work. It's used to undercut those scholars and so forth. And a lot of this writing came out of, was inspired by, I participated in the 3C program out of Duke, which is the Cultural Competence in Computing program, which was training for computer science educators in creating courses that focus on these topics. And based off of that, I taught a course at Mines on race and computing, which then designing that course, teaching that course, having the conversations that came out of that course helped to push me in this direction. And I think that it is, especially the issues of race, I think are important to write about right now, because there's almost nothing in robotics that's written on that. And I think we have the human robot interaction community is much better about talking about gender. Even there, it has evolved a lot in the last 10 years, 15 years, where in 15 years ago, it was a lot of we're going to look at gender because maybe men and women think about gender, robot gender differently, which tended towards biological essentialism in some problematic ways. Whereas today, it's gotten much better, and it's how can we bring in feminist perspectives into the design of robots and so forth. But there's very little other than the work of maybe Rob Sparrow, Christoph Bartnek, Daria Bryant. There are more people now who are working in issues of race, but it's still sort of on you can count the number of people who are writing about these things on a hand and a half.
Yeah, well, I imagine that this book is for more of a general population and maybe also academics in the HRI community.
Yep.
I'm wondering if, with that said, you could speak to designers or for folks, say, in Silicon Valley, where there's billions of money, That's where I'm at today. Billions of dollars going into the development of robots.
Yep.
When you're talking to developers or people in industry who are designing robots, is there something that you recommend for how they can operationalize this history?
Yeah. So for context, the book it's an academic book, but my intention is for it to be highly accessible because the people who I really want to read it, yes, academics within my community, but really the next generation of robot designers who might be taking a tech ethics class, right? And maybe hopefully would be assigned a chapter out of it. And that means tech ethics students could mean anyone who's a senior in college or enrolled in graduate school, right? Which means it's going to be more broadly accessible. I didn't want people to have any type of robotics knowledge to engage with the book. And so I'm sorry, what was the question?
Oh, it was around industry and developers.
Right. Yeah. So in terms of recommendations, then, each of the main chapters of the book is basically broken up into 3 parts. I talk about the history and sort of where we got to where we are today. I talk about then considerations today and the sort of ethical issues today we have with robots in each of these domains of power based off of that history. And then I talk about how we move forward. And when I'm talking about how to move forward, I try to include a couple different options of fundamentally different types of perspectives, ways that we might just revise how we are continuing to work within the same paradigm, but sort of shifting our perspective to try to avoid maybe the most egregious outcomes. More fundamentally, how we might reimagine and re-envision our approach by questioning some of the default assumptions, while still remaining sort of connected to the current approach. And then finally, approaches that more fundamentally rip up the status quo by looking back at the history that we had talked about and saying, well, what if we rethink that? Right? If history had gone a different way, right? Or if we weren't making those core assumptions, where might we go that's differently? And I don't think I try to emphasize that there's no silver bullet in most of these domains. So with robot appearance design, it's very complicated, right? You on the one hand, you might say, well, the problem is that so many of our robots today are designed in these images of either white men in certain contexts or white women in other contexts. Maybe we need more diverse robots. But the problem there, right, is if you're saying, well, does that mean that we're going to be designing more robots in the image of people of color, which is then problematic when these are robots that are being designed, again, because of the history of the robot imaginary, are being put into domains where they're acting as servants, right? So that's a problem. And so to some extent, it depends on who's designing it, right? Where we see this with like AAVE in robots. I've been talking a lot about robot appearance, right? But a lot of this is also about like what a robot says, the words it uses, its prosody, etc., right? There have been a number of people who have been using like robots speaking in AAVE, African American Vernacular English, as a like a decolonialist design method, right, or as a anti-racist design method, right. However, last week there was a I don't remember right now, but like there was a news story about a tech company that was having its like voice assistant speak in AAVE, and the people on the internet were all up in arms, right? Because it was perceived as that company, and probably predominantly white and Asian engineers, pursuing that in a way that some people were interpreting more as like blackface, right?
Yeah.
As like a digitalized blackface. So it depends on who is, not just like what the design solution looks like, but who the designers are and what their motivation is for that approach, right? Yeah. And so I try to emphasize in the book like the space of different solutions, but also what the problems with those solutions are, and also emphasize the need for non-technical solutions, right? It isn't just about what the robots look like, it's about who we are designing, who we are hiring to put on our robot design teams, what domains we are putting robots into and why, whether robots are really the right solution in the first place. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that's been a question that's been in my mind as we've been talking, is do we just take as many identity markers or maybe visual identity markers, or it sounds like audio, out of the robot? So I'm going to assume that we're going to keep having humanoid robots.
Yeah.
Should we just like asexualize, agender, aracialize robots?
Well, so that's challenging, and so some people have proposed that, but the problem with that is if you try to strip the identity characteristics away, then everything else just flows in to fill the gaps, right? So if you can imagine, right? If you've got on your phone, right? If you've got a voice assistant, right? Your phone does not have identity characteristics, but if you hear the voice, right? You immediately racialize and gender the voice, and people have tried to make agender voices. It's very difficult, but even then, if you have a robot that has a completely non-human-like form, and we're talking about interactive robots primarily here. So let's say it's still talking, but it's talking in a way that doesn't have clear characteristics of race and gender, or class, or ethnicity in them. But it's put into a domain that is traditionally associated with a particular identity group, then people are still going to associate it with that identity group, right? And so some of the alternatives there would be like cross-stereotypic design, where you give it clear identity characteristics, but ones that run counter to the domain, hopefully in a way that's more sensitively designed than like the space robotics example I had before. Yep. Or my lab has been examining things like agender design, but in a way where we're not necessarily trying to strip out identity characteristics, but instead using like agender identity as a design characteristic. So I had a student in my lab who was non-binary. And so they were interested, he/they pronouns, they were interested in exploring trans and non-binary perspectives on robots. So they interviewed a number of trans and non-binary users. They showed them these robot designs that they had used, where they had a robot with a not clearly gendered form. It was speaking in a not super gendered voice. It described itself as themselves as using they/them pronouns, right? And they just presented as not a genderless, but as a character with an agender identity. And they got the users' perspectives on this, and it was really interesting seeing both the pros and the cons, right? Where the trans and non-binary users that he talked to were really interested in it and were really excited about the design, and said they perceived it as an agender character. They saw it as helping to push back on agender, on like stereotypes, or helping to expose people to non-binary identities that otherwise they might not be exposed to. But on the other hand, they pointed out things like, rainbow capitalism. Again, like if Google said they were coming out with the first like agender robot, and that's what you hear about, like you would have some concerns, right? Yeah. And then they also highlighted that it depends on what the space of robots are. If all the robots are like that, and it then means that people are more likely to encounter an agender robot than an agender human, it might have the effect of dehumanizing real people. And so they were those users who talked about that. The sort of takeaway was this could be really cool if it's used in the space of other robot designs.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure how to ask this question. I'm just thinking about, as we're talking about this subject of social justice and robotics in the current political climate that we're in. And so we don't need to go too hard into partisan politics one way or another. But I am wondering, for you as an author navigating getting this book out in the world that does mention social justice, and I guess as an academic too, how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's challenging because we are at a moment in time when educators might be worried for good reason to increase the amount of content of this type in their classes, especially in my robot ethics class, right? There's a strong social justice component in it, and it tends to be a class that is very polarizing, where like 3/4 of the class loves it, and the other quarter of the class does not. And either for two reasons. Either because they're being asked to read and write extensively for the first time in their engineering curriculum, or because they're like, what is this woke BS, right? And those students are giving faculty evaluations. They might be complaining to the school. Their parents might be, they might be sending you to like right wing watch or whatever, like the professor watch lists, right? And so I think there are reasons right now where people are justifiably worried about maybe their personal safety for talking about these types of things. On the other hand, I think for those exact same reasons, we're at a moment in time when it's like more important than ever to be talking about these issues and making sure that we are educating the next generation of engineers about these issues of how what they're doing actually interact with society, and it is not just informed by, but feeds back and reinforces societal trends that are related in deep ways to everything that's going on politically right now. So it's a complicated time, but in some ways, I am glad that it's coming out at a time when these issues are, when many students, it isn't difficult for most students to see the relevance and why these issues are relevant right now when there are these, when those same students are getting freaked out by DEI efforts being cut at universities or being hidden or what have you. And so I think it's really important at this moment in time.
Yeah, as we move towards closing, unfortunately, I do want to know if you want to highlight anything else that we haven't covered from the book. I know there's a lot in the book. I know you talk about surveillance a little bit, but is there any like big take home that you'd want to highlight?
So the one thing we haven't talked a lot about is policing, and this is also it's the last main chapter of the book before the conclusion, but it's also in some ways what sort of pushed the writing of the book in the first place, where like in 2020, in the aftermath of like George Floyd, and we're in lockdown in the pandemic, and from my balcony in Denver, like armored like SWAT tanks going through the streets. There's people getting tear gassed and shot at by police blocks from my apartment, and in that moment, I got really concerned with what was going on with robotics and the police, and we launched this No Justice, No Robotics, No Justice, No Robots campaign to get people to a roboticist who agreed not to work with the police. And that sort of pushed, a lot of my work in this direction, but also later caused reflection on, well, what can we do beyond petition campaigns, right? To have practical and like real impacts in the ways that our roboticists are designing and deploying robots. And so at the end of the book, I sort of come full circle with that, and also end with an abolitionist perspective, and argue strongly for an abolitionist perspective in robotics. So I guess that would be the thing that maybe we hadn't talked about so much, but that I think is really important in the context of the book.
Absolutely. And as we ask everyone, is there, and again, this is blatantly stolen from Ezra Klein, is there a book, movie, music, other piece of media that you would recommend to someone?
Well, I'm going to give two answers. The first is that I think I'm contractually obligated to say my book is relevant, right? Degrees of Freedom on Robotics and Social Justice from MIT Press. It'll be out this late fall this year. It's available for pre-order right now, but it's expensive. And the reason for that is because when it comes out, it'll also be available for free. So anyone will be able to read it for free with a PDF from the MIT Press website. And so if you go to my website, which is tomwilliams.phd, there's a link to pre-order, but there's also a link to sign up for updates. And so I have a newsletter where I'm sharing information about the book and its evolution, and which I will also be using to help get that link to the free PDF into as many students' hands as possible. The other book I would recommend that is not mine. I've got lots of books here to choose from, although the ways that this is organized is the top shelf is all books I have not read, and everything below that is fiction that I have read, whereas all of the nonfiction I've read...
For listeners who are not seeing the video, Tom has a massive bookcases perhaps, behind him right now. Yeah. It's a very impressive library.
Thank you. But these are all the fiction I've read. All the nonfiction I've read goes to work, so I don't have any... good fiction books to recommend, or nonfiction books to recommend with me, but that's a good excuse for me to highlight some amazing fiction. The book I will recommend, which is my favorite book that I read last year, Babel by R.F. Kuang, which is a fantasy novel set at Oxford, and it is about the ways that academics participate in colonialism. The ways that the act of translation does violence through what it chooses to include and what it leaves out. And personally, as somebody who works in robotics and AI and natural language understanding and generation, I found a lot of it really to be about the ways that, or my reading of it, tied a lot to the ways that natural language technologies participate in those dynamics, serve as tools of oppression, reinforce colonial dynamics. So a fantastic book of fiction, but also like really politically relevant right now.
Well, as we close, I'm going to give that one last pitch. Pick up Degrees of Freedom on Robotics and Social Justice this fall. It's out through MIT Press, and it will be free when it is out. So please do put that at least on your list. Subscribe to the update feed. Tom, one more time, what is that link or where they can find it?
The easiest way is to go to tomwilliams.phd, and there's a link that says Get Book Updates, but you can find it directly with all of the previous posts at tomwilliamsphd.beehiiv.com.
Wonderful. Tom, thank you so much for being on the show today and for the awesome scholarship that you're doing.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much to Tom for joining us today, and we're stoked to get his book, Degrees of Freedom on Robotics and Social Justice, out into the world in, again, a few short months where it will be free through MIT Press. But for now, thanks so much for joining us today on AI-tocracy, where we are visioning a new world of technology, a positive world, a hopeful world, and where we're still workshopping that tagline, help us out if you can. I love this conversation. I really appreciated Tom and his perspective on robotics, and I hope you did too. Please follow us and our weekly episodes on Apple, on Spotify, on YouTube. If you're on YouTube, you can see me doing all this weird hand gesture stuff in the background. If you're not, you're really missing out. But thank you. And we'll see you next time on AI Talkracy.